Okay, so let me just say this right out of the gate. I don't scare easy. I've sat through Hereditary with a straight face. I've watched every episode of The Terror without flinching once. And I genuinely think most modern horror has kind of forgotten how to be unsettling in a way that sticks with you after the credits roll. So when I tell you that Widow's Bay genuinely got under my skin, I need you to understand what that actually means. Because this show isn't just good. It's doing something I haven't seen a series do in a long, long time. And it's doing it by making you laugh. Widow's Bay dropped on Apple TV Plus on April 29th, 2026, and the premise sounds almost too simple at first glance. A skeptical mayor trying to lead the superstitious residents of a cursed New England island. 10 episodes. One island. A whole lot of weird. But here's what the log line doesn't tell you. This show is one of the most carefully constructed, genuinely unsettling, and laugh-out-loud funny pieces of television I've watched in years. And the fact that it manages to be all three of those things simultaneously, without any of them canceling each other out, is kind of a miracle. The show was created by Katie Dippold, who previously wrote Ghostbusters and The Heat, so she has serious comedy credentials. But what she's doing here is different. This isn't horror sprinkled with a few jokes to lighten the mood. The comedy in Widow's Bay is woven so deeply into the tension that the two things become almost indistinguishable. And here's the thing that I kept noticing, and this is what I think separates this show from almost everything else in the genre. The jokes don't relieve the tension. They increase it. Every time you laugh, you feel slightly guilty about it because whatever just happened was also kind of horrible. And that discomfort, that's the whole point. That's the engine of this show. Think about how most horror comedies work. Something scary happens. A character makes a quip, the audience exhales. Rinse and repeat. It's a formula. It's safe. Widow's Bay doesn't do that. Instead, what Dippold has built is a world where the humor comes from how deeply, almost tragically, out of their depth everyone is. The comedy is situational, yes, but it's also existential. These are people who are completely unequipped to deal with what's happening to them, and watching them try to cope with bureaucracy, with pride, with sheer denial, is both hilarious and genuinely scary. Because if these people are all we've got, we're done. Mayor Tom Loftus, played by Matthew Rhys, is desperate to revive his struggling community. There's no Wi-Fi, spotty cellular reception, and he must contend with superstitious locals who believe their island is cursed. He wants these people to respect him. They don't. They think he is soft and cowardly. And he is. And that right there is the core of the whole show. Because Tom Loftus isn't a hero. He's not even a particularly competent mayor. He's a man running from something. Maybe failure, maybe irrelevance. And he's decided that transforming this crumbling little island into a tourist destination is how he proves his worth. To his community, to his son, maybe mostly to himself. And the tragedy is that he's actually kind of succeeding. Miraculously, he succeeds. Tourists are finally coming. Unfortunately, the locals were right. After decades of calm, the old stories that seemed too ludicrous to be true start happening again. What Rhys does with this character is genuinely impressive, and I say that as someone who already knew he was great from the Americans. But here he's doing something more delicate. Tom Loftus is a man whose entire identity is built on rationalism, on the idea that superstition is for small-minded people, that he's the enlightened outsider who can see through the fog of small-town mythology. And the show slowly, methodically dismantles that. You watch him come up with increasingly desperate logical explanations for things that have no logical explanation. And there's something almost painful about it, because you can see the exact moment he stops believing his own excuses. He doesn't announce it. It's in his eyes. It's in the way he starts walking a little differently, speaking a little more carefully. And Rhys plays all of that without ever overplaying it. It's the kind of performance that makes you forget you're watching a performance. Director Hiro Murai, known for Atlanta and The Bear, noted that the script has so much hard comedy alongside truly scary, terrifying horror, while remaining emotionally honest about its characters. And that's exactly it. Emotionally honest is the phrase that keeps coming back to me when I try to describe why this show works as well as it does. The characters, even the bizarre ones, Even the ones who feel like they wandered in from some fever dream version of a Coen Brothers movie all feel like they have real inner lives, real histories, real reasons for being who they are. And speaking of those characters, let's talk about the supporting cast for a second, because this is where the show really starts to shine in ways that I didn't expect. Kate O'Flynn as Patricia, Dale Dickey as Rosemary, and Stephen Root as Wick are all locals working with, and often also against, Tom. And these performances are something else. Stephen Root, who has been quietly one of the best character actors in the business for 30 years, brings this wonderful, weathered quality to Wick, like someone who has watched too many generations of outsiders come to this island convinced they understand it, and has simply run out of the energy to explain why they're wrong. And Dale Dickey as Rosemary is doing something really interesting. She's playing someone who knows things, who has maybe always known things, but delivers that knowledge with such matter-of-fact bluntness that you can never quite tell if she's being cryptic or just genuinely tired of having to explain the obvious. What really stood out to me, though, is how the show uses these characters to create a kind of collective dread. Because individually, each of these quirky islanders is funny. But collectively, they're terrifying. There's this unspoken consensus among them, this shared knowledge they all seem to carry. And the gap between what they know and what Tom knows is where the horror lives. You feel it every time one of them gives Tom a look that lasts just a fraction too long. Every time someone doesn't answer a question directly. It reminded me, and I say this genuinely, not as a cheap comparison, of the way early episodes of Twin Peaks made you feel like every single resident of that town was hiding something, like the town itself had agreed to keep a secret. Widow's Bay is a quaint island town 40 miles off the coast of New England. And that detail, 40 miles off the coast, matters more than you'd think. Because isolation in horror is never just geographic. It's psychological. It's the feeling that even if you wanted help, it's too far away to matter. The New England setting specifically carries so much cultural weight. Lovecraft, Salem, the whole mythology of coastal dread, of things that come from a sea, and the show leans into all of that without ever feeling derivative. It earns its atmosphere. The fog feels real. The ocean sounds threatening. The architecture of the town feels like it was designed by someone who wanted to make escape feel impossible. Here's a theory I've been sitting with. I don't think the curse in Widow's Bay is supernatural in the traditional sense. Or at least, I don't think the show wants you to be sure. Because what if the real curse is something closer to collective belief? The Islanders have believed in this thing for so long that they've built their entire culture around it. Their behavior, their rituals, their relationship to outsiders. And when Tom brings tourists in, when he invites people who don't share that belief system, maybe what gets disturbed isn't some ancient sea hag, but something more fragile and more dangerous. The agreement that makes a community function. The moment outsiders arrive who don't respect the rules that everyone was silently following, everything unravels. That reading doesn't make the horror any less real. If anything, it makes it more unsettling. And this gets at something the show does really well that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about. It's deeply about what happens when you refuse to listen. Tom's arc isn't just a skeptic discovers the supernatural story. It's a story about a man so committed to his own narrative of progress, of reason, of being right, that he can't hear what everyone around him is trying to tell him. And the show is careful never to make Tom stupid. He's not stupid. He's just defended. Defended in the way that people who have decided who they are become defended. And that makes watching him infinitely more interesting than watching a simple fool stumble into danger. The series achieved a 100% fresh score on Rotten Tomatoes, with publications like the Daily Beast calling it the year's best new show and critics repeatedly noting it feels unlike anything else on television. And I understand that. I genuinely understand that reaction. But I also want to be honest with you because I think you're owed that. This show is not for everyone. If you need your horror clean, if you need your comedy broad, if you need those two things to stay in their separate lanes, Widow's Bay is going to frustrate you. It lives in the space between those things, in the ambiguity and the discomfort. There are moments where you genuinely aren't sure if you're supposed to be laughing or scared, and the show does not resolve that tension for you. It just holds it there and watches you. Score Matthew Rhys said during Apple TV's press day that the tone was something he had never read anything like, and that growing up with films like The Wicker Man and Jaws made the opportunity feel like a true dream job. And you can feel that love on screen. This doesn't feel like a product. It feels like something people genuinely wanted to make. A show that takes its genre seriously enough to interrogate it, and takes its audience seriously enough not to explain itself too much. Apple TV Plus has been quietly building one of the most interesting libraries in streaming. Severance, Bad Monkey, Slow Horses, The Morning Show at its best. And Widow's Bay feels like the next chapter in that story. These are shows that trust you to sit with complexity, to not need every mystery solved, to find meaning in ambiguity. And in a landscape where most streaming content is optimized within an inch of its life to be as broadly appealing as possible, that trust feels rare and genuinely valuable. So here's where I land. Widow's Bay is not a perfect show. It's weird in ways that will lose some viewers, and there are moments in the middle stretch where the pacing gets a little wobbly. But it's the kind of imperfect that comes from genuine creative ambition, from people trying to do something they haven't quite seen done before and mostly pulling it off. It's the kind of television that makes you want to talk about it after, that leaves things half said and trusts you to finish the thought. And maybe that's the real curse of Widow's Bay. Not the sea hag, not the old stories come back to life, but the fact that once it gets into your head, it's kind of hard to get out. You'll find yourself thinking about it in the quiet moments, turning it over, wondering if that detail meant what you think it meant. That's what the best horror does. It doesn't just scare you while you're watching. It follows you home.